Now we have several videos that focus on 40-acre private parcels or less. And you know, to some people 40 acres is a large parcel. Even myself, the 2 parcels that I hunt, they're really hunting. And I could add the third one in there too. The third one is 40 acres. We have 8 acres of cover. There's one that's 52 acres. Take out the 12-acre horse pasture and then 10 acres of open fields. We have 30 acres of cover. And then on the other one, it's 25 acres of cover. And that includes about 1.25 acres of food plots. So I'm hunting properties that really, and I'm not talking 300-acre parcels with 20 acres of cover. I'm talking about 25 with 25, 40 acres with 8, and again, going back to the 52, which is 30 acres of cover. Those are small to some people, but let's face it, to others, they're really large parcels. And I think the concepts are the same, whether you're looking at a 40-acre parcel, a 10-acre parcel, but I want to focus on some 10-acre, 5-acre type micro parcels and what you have. And I wrote about this in my food plot book. I've touched on this in my Whitetail Success by Design book. That's the red book and the green book. And so I'll focus on those 2 areas. But a 5 to 10 acre parcel, how many of you have that out there? It might seem like a daunting task, and people say, you know, I only have 5 acres, there's not much I can do. Well, I wanted to make sure that you're prioritizing what you are doing with those micro parcels. And again, 5 to 10 acres, 15 acres, somewhere around in there. What you should be doing depending on the type of habitat that you have in your area. And I'll mention, I'm going to leave these right here for a couple videos because this is a success. These $5, one on 25 acre the 25, and then we shot 4 of these on the 30 acre parcel, 30 acre cover parcel. So there's a lot that you can be done on small parcels. And I will say most of my neighbors are not shooting mature bucks around us. And you might think that's unfair, but I feel like we do it right, we hunt it right, and these are the rewards. And these are the rewards I want for you, even if you only have 5 to 10 acre parcels. First parcel I want to look at is a wooded parcel. Let's say you only have 5 to 10 acres in the UP of Michigan, northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, the big hardwood hills of Kentucky, Pennsylvania. Those are really unique because there's already lots of cover around. If you're in a wilderness area, if you're in a big woods area. So if you go into your property and just make a lot of cover, even if it's good hardwood regeneration, even if it's good shrub tip, briar regeneration, where you have a lot of browse on your property, it's really going to get lost in the sea of habitat that surrounds you in cover, even if it's open cover. Deer really have a lot of space. In those areas, what drives attraction is not browse, it's not cover, it's not hinge cuts, it's not deer bedding areas, it's food. So I've seen this time and time again. I lived in the UP of Michigan for 14 years. I had property up there for a long time, hunted on public land, I hunted on my own private land. I was a real estate appraiser up there, so I got to see a lot of rural properties, as you can imagine. A 10-acre property that's surrounded by national forest on a mile dead-end road. I have a friend that has a property like that. I've seen a few of those. In those locations, food is at a premium. Food is critically important. If you have a situation like that, especially when you have protected borders, either on 2 sides, 3 sides, or all sides, you do not have fence sitters right on your line. And I've seen a lot of these like this. Maybe non-hunting neighbors, maybe properties that are public land that people just can't get into, but you need to have food. And you need to have lasting food. And the problem is in these areas is that if you put a half acre of food, even if you only have 10 deer per square mile, the deer will eat you out of house and home just because there's nothing else green for them to eat, nothing else quality to eat. So you have to figure out a food plot that will last. What I found in those areas is layers of rye, where let's say your first frost date is middle of September, then you're planting your first layer of rye middle of August. 3 weeks later, you're planting another 100 acres, and again, 3 weeks after that, you're planting another 100 acres. If you look at, or 100 pounds per acre. If you look up layering rye for whitetails, I've been talking about this for many years. It's a system that I developed, a practice that I developed many years ago, and it's worked. I developed it because I wanted my food plots to last in that type of an area. If you put a Nebraska plot in that area and it's the only thing green, they can dismantle it. Soybeans won't even make it to the end of the summer. Very, very non-browse tolerant. Clover, same way. You're going to have the clover down to the dirt by October 1st. You have that frost in September, the clover's not growing, and you have zero food. But what I found with rye is you get a warm up in early December and it's 55 degrees, that rye is going to perk right up and even grow a little bit. So what I found was layered rye works really well. And let's face it, anything you can get green to last, that's great. And it might be that you're down in Kentucky or northern West Virginia, some area where it's a little bit warmer and your plots will live longer. then you might be able to get away with clover in a situation like that. But if you only have 5-10 acres, I would encourage you to get as high a percentage of that acreage into food plot, in particular slanted towards the side without much hunting pressure. If it backs up to public land, it's ideal. If it backs up to a non-hunting neighbor, ideal. Leave yourself a little bit of cover so you can have room for a couple stand locations where deer come in and out of that particular side. A couple stand locations on the back side of cover as it relates to food. And what you're really trying to do is put that food in a location where you can access and hunt alongside it, or as deer are entering or exiting that food source, on the safe side of your property, whether it's 2 sides, 3 sides, 1 side, whatever it might be. But the power of food in a wooded parcel cannot be underestimated, and that is what you need to focus on if your property is wooded. Now the next one, if you're in mid-ag area and you have a small parcel like that, and I would count where we're at, the southwest Wisconsin area, portions of southern Michigan, especially towards Grand Rapids or Lansing, maybe even Jackson, where you have a little bit more woods mixed in. Not northern Ohio, where there's not a tree for 1.5 miles in any direction, but more where it's 50-50 ag, 40-60, 60-40, 30-70, whatever it might be. Then what you use your food for on that parcel, you don't want all cover, because you're surrounded by ag. You have cover in the area. A lot of times in those locations in ag areas where you do not have ag, it's because there's a lot of cover, meaning it's rocky, it's hilly, it's wet. And so you have areas of good cover in those locations, a lot of times a lot of diversity. It's not just open hardwoods, or they probably would have been thinned and removed and turned into ag many decades ago. In those locations, I still like to create as much cover as possible, but I like to create a food source within there that actually moves deer. So instead of 5 to 10 acres in a wooded area where you're converting 3 to 7 or 3 to 6, 3 to 5 acres into food, in this location you might have an acre of food or a half acre of food. You want to have long lines of food, ribbons of food, where they parallel your borders. They turn around, they turn in the corners like a NASCAR track, where you're not trying to steer those deer off a 90-degree angle. It's more like Bristol, where it just sweeps them around. You want to keep the deer on your property, focused on your property, running parallel to your borders. Those food sources shouldn't be more than 10 to 8 feet wide, or 8 to 10 feet wide, maybe 20 feet wide at the most, because the more width you have, the more it turns into a stop and stand food source where deer aren't traveling. You're trying to set up mock scrapes along this corridor. You look at it more of as a feeding corridor. Think of it, maybe, let's say you have a rectangle 10-acre parcel. It's 330 by 1320. That's a common 10-acre size. On the east side, you have a big chunk of woods that might total 5, 6, 7 acres that you're turning into habitat. And on the west side, you're taking a line of food out that might be 20 feet wide. It might go along your border to the north, down the west side, and then down the south side and back into that cover. So it's almost like a sea of a food plot with the amount of cover on the inside. So you're really trying to pull deer out of that cover and sweep them back into the cover, and then that sets up stand locations on the back side of the cover for the morning on the east side, on the south side, west side, north side of the food as deer are moving around that, cruising areas for bucks during the season, because you're not making that food source too wide, and you end up having 3/4 of an acre to an acre of food, and it sets up a lot of stand locations so that when deer come into that area, you have 5 or 6 acres that are very thick, that move deer within. You're trying to convert those woods or timber or brush to actual bedding areas on the east side in that situation, and then you're moving deer around that so that you can actually get a shot of them. And let's face it, in mixed ag, if you go around and you think about it right now, to have a location that has 8, 9 acres of food and cover that's unpressured by hunters, where you're taking really selective chances at moving into those stand locations around that parcel, taking very precision hunts that you're using the wind in your face and you're facing into that unpressured cover and food, you really have very few areas that have 8 or 9 acres in your neighborhood typically that are unpressured and have quality food and habitat. And that's what sets that 10-acre parcel. You can actually have 10 acres that's a lot more valuable than an 80 to 120 acre parcel in that area, if that 80 to 120 acre parcel is all hardwoods, even if it's surrounded by ag. I just had a question yesterday at the gas station. I had someone come up to me and said, asked me if I was who I was and if I worked on property. And that person said that, we have this big chunk of timber, it's all hardwoods. We have corn on top, we have corn down the bottom in the ag fields. We don't know why we just have does on our property. Well, it's because it's just all open hardwoods. They have too much food on the top and the bottom in October, November. It creates a situation where there's a lack of cover within that 80 to 120 acres. It's easy to overpressure that because deer can see you from a quarter mile through the open timber, and that's why they do not see bucks during the season. So you can have a 10-acre parcel that has thick cover and some food plot lines to connect that cover, putting that food safely on the edge where you don't have your neighbors looking over it. And that's how you can take a 10-acre parcel in a mixed ag area and make it a very high valuable parcel compared to everything else in the area. Conventional wisdom tells you that bigger is better when it comes to parcels. 80 to 120 acres will beat out that 10, but that is not the case when you selectively manage a really definitive pattern and movement and holding cover on that 10 acres. And you can beat out the guys with 80 to 120 acres, the hunters that have a much larger parcel, and actually pretty easy to do, especially when they apply a little hunting pressure, they don't have quality food, and they don't have quality cover. Now third, heavy ag. And that's where northern Ohio comes in, southern Michigan, northern Indiana, from Fort Wayne on up, maybe even Indy on up, and central Illinois on up, southern Wisconsin, even portions of Minnesota that are flat, but big areas where you have open ag and very little cover. And you probably guessed it, in areas like that, cover is at a premium. I've seen that even in Iowa, where you take an 8 to 10 acre parcel, you make it as thick as possible. If it's open field that you're buying, you can convert it into switchgrass in pockets of early successional growth, where you can move deer from one pocket to the other around the edges of your borders, paralleling the borders. A lot of these parcels, you want that movement to be parallel to your borders, because then you can have multiple stand locations with multiple winds. But pretty easy to take an overgrown field and convert it to whitetail habitat within 2 years. You don't need to plant a lot of trees, shrubs, conifers, and certainly not miscanthus grass. We have another video about that that's coming out tomorrow. That takes years to establish and doesn't even establish well in certain areas. So you're looking at something like switchgrass that'll take over in 2 years. It'll be 7 to 8 feet tall, offer sufficient cover. You want to plant at 8 to 10 pounds per acre. I have lots of planting advice on switchgrass and how to do that. And then you mix it with early successional growth, so you have broadleafs and hardwood regeneration for food during the bedding hours. And if you have a big woodlot of hardwoods, you're knocking that timber down. You're moving at least 50-60% of the canopy. Just because it's an oak doesn't mean it's a good oak. If it's a leaner, if it's a subordinate, if it's a multi-forked, low mass, no mass tree, get it out of there. Just because it has an oak name doesn't mean it's good, unfortunately. You need open canopy. And even if it was all big oaks in there, that means there's no cover. So that means your deer stand, your neighbors, they might come into your property at night, and that's not a good situation either. You have to have thick cover in those areas where there's a lot of ag. And it starts by determining if it's overgrown field, you're doing it this way, adding the switchgrass, early successional growth pockets. If it's in a hardwoods, then you're knocking that timber down. If it's in a mixed canopy, conifer growth, then you're manipulating the habitat, maybe opening up the canopy underneath the conifers, opening up pockets in gray dogwood. You're hinge cutting. If it's aspen, you're removing pockets so you get full 7,000 shoots per acre regeneration. But you're making that parcel thick because cover is at a premium in those low cover regions. And those are 3 ways, 3 areas that you can take 3 different focuses, from heavy woods, wilderness areas where there might not even be a lot of deer, but food is at a premium, to a mixed area where you're taking light food to define travel around very thick cover areas that give you a multitude of stand locations. And then finally in those open ag areas that have hardly any. I've been on property in northern Ohio that had 26 acres for my client. The neighbor had 20 acres, and that 46 acres was the biggest chunk of cover within 2 miles in any direction. In those cases, huge premium on cover. And so those are 3 ways to take a 5 to 15 acre parcel, turn it into a gem this year. And so don't shy away, whether you're buying one, leasing one, getting permission to hunt on one. Those little hidden parcels can be gems. And if you match it with the flow of the terrain, if it's on a river system, creek system, you're matching it with that water, you can turn a micro parcel into a mega buck hunting and success whitetail parcel this season, and it doesn't take that long.